many people, I've always been fascinated with vampires. They've always intrigued me, the fact, the fiction, whether those overlap at all. And that's what we're going to find out. We're going up to London, going to take a look around the vampire subculture and hopefully answer that inevitable question, do vampires exist? Or at least do people think they exist?
Not in the I'm immortal, I live forever, I get killed by the sun and all of that stuff.
I don't. I mean, I don't believe that there is an eternal being who goes around sucking blood.
No, I don't. I don't believe I'm a vampire. I don't believe in vampires.
Yes and no. That's not a contradiction. You see, I think what confuses people a lot of the time, especially quite a few of my critics, is the word vampire, because we're taking it to mean two different things. If we're taking vampire to mean vampire in the sense that it's portrayed by Hammer horror movies, or even Bram Stoker, that is a sort of a creature that sleeps in a coffin by day and goes out and ravages young ladies at night and sucks their blood and subsequently turns them into vampires, which can only be destroyed by a wooden stone, which can't cross running water, which hates the sign of the cross. I think that's absolute nonsense.
Right, okay. Well, we best take a look at fiction first then.
Most people think of vampires, they think of Dracula straight off. That's obviously the archetypal vampire, if you will.
People have said that Dracula is the greatest love story ever told, and it is a love story. The blood and the fangs and the black capes and the climbing up walls is generally incidental to the real story, which is not that far removed from most romantic novels.
But I'm sure that he was inspired by these myths of the incubus and succubus, which were already in existence. And I'm sure when he came to write Dracula, he used all these ingredients. Of course, he embellished it, and hence we have the makings of the modern-day vampire.
It's stuck very well, and it's always getting used. I mean, everything that mentions vampires always has a link back to Dracula at some point. So if you know if you've heard the word vampire, you've heard the name Dracula. You can't ever escape it.
It's very hard to draw any conclusions from it. It's just a damn good yarn.
A bit of mystery, a bit of suspense. It's horror as well. People like horror films. They're going to watch a vampire film. Oh, yeah, it's quite scary. But I suppose vampires have sort of been romanticised over the years. We get these images. I mean, Dracula himself, he was a killer and he was a fiend, but he was also like he was an aristocrat and he was a gent. So he had a sort of calm, upper class way about it. He didn't go around slashing people to death madly with an axe. He killed scarily and with stealth.
Chris Lee was for me, was the original Dracula. It was much later that I saw the Bela Lugosi stuff. But Chris Lee was the original Dracula for me, seeing him in the Hammer horrors when they showed him on TV.
He's lonely, deranged, but he's still the sex god, you know. He's the Tom Jones of the vampire world, you know.
You've had so many people, Bela Lugosi and all those really classic people who acted as Dracula, were just cool, and some of the people nowadays just suck in a not toothy way. So, okay, they made some of the best films about him, but then again, he was just some Irish bloke's fantasy.
It's common knowledge that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based on a real-life person, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes, whatever you know him as. But was there any truth in that? Was Vlad Tepes a vampire?
When Bram Stoker's Dracula came out, the Coppola film with Gary Oldman, there was suddenly a big interest in vampires. Up to that point, there hadn't been a decent vampire film in ages, basically. And when that came out, my then girlfriend saw an advert in the paper advertising the Dracula tour going to Romania, which we went on. And although it wasn't really a Dracula tour, we did visit a couple of places associated with the real historical Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad Tepes is a true character. He impaled his victim. He was a very bloodthirsty man, didn't drink blood.
But the spirit of the vampire is the bit that holds it through with other stories. And if it's got a basis in fact, then that fact is lodged with Vlad the Impaler. And if Vlad the Impaler was a vampire, then his lifestyle, hence the impaling and general blood use, would have hidden it quite nicely. No one would know that Vlad Tepes was a vampire because he was steeped in other people's blood all the time.
Dracula is undeniably the original text, but recently we've had Anne Rice come out. She wrote Interview with a Vampire. She's written 9 books in the Vampire Chronicles. And what do people think of her?
Her early stuff is brilliant. Her later books are not so good. So no, I don't think she's overrated about her early stuff. But now it's just a hype and it's a rolling sort of thing. It's like snowball. And now I think she just writes vampire books to make the money now, not for the whole love of writing. You know, she knows she can sell, how many copies just by writing a vampire.
I have purposefully avoided Anne Rice all the time. I've seen an Interview with a Vampire, which I did enjoy, but every person who's told me to read Anne Rice has said to be prepared for a long read, and I don't have time. I like things to move at a very quick pace. That's why Hammer films are so good. They were an hour and a half and they were full of blood. That's lovely. It just gets done. I've always avoided Anne Rice because I just can't be bothered to sit down and read it. I'm sure it's very good.
The characters of Louis and Lestat in Interview with the Vampire were very good. And so was Armand. Although Armand changed completely from the books, I think he was the epitome of what everyone thinks of vampire is: the long dark hair, the long fingernails.
So it seems Anne Rice, like so many authors, have taken from Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Bram Stoker's Dracula took from certain fact. So it seems every single fiction is linked to fact in some way. I spoke to Martin Prince, an author who lives in Kent, and he put a notice out on the internet to ask any vampires using the net to reply to him so he'd have some kind of inspiration to incorporate into his stories. So, what did he find out?
If I had 250 responses from vampires, which probably is not far off, I'd say 5 or 6 of them might be genuine, which is quite a high percentage if you consider the magnitude of what I'm saying. If it is actually true, then out of those there are some genuine ones out there. Quite why they'd be surfing the web. I suppose being lonely, it's a good outlet for it. I let their stories or what they've said deeply influence what I write and try and have the same suggestions in the stories. And I suppose the common theme that comes across from all of these people is a sadness and a loneliness. Whether they're genuine or not, there's a loneliness involved with it.
Well, the word vampire is Latin, I think. It comes from vampiro, which means darkness.
So all of these codes and conventions that masquerade as fiction have got to have come from somewhere. But where is that somewhere?
Well, vampires have a basis in sort of every civilization's culture. Anyway, every society, every civilization has vampire myths of a certain type. They vary, but there is always the common denominators of the blood drinking and the undead elements. There's a sound basis that a lot of this was started with fact, even if it's very far removed from what we know as vampires today. Otherwise, every culture would not have this common denominator. It would have branched off a lot more than it did. So I think that appeals to people's sense of history as well, that their culture, as well as everyone else's, has this common ancestry, if you like.
It's been present with the Aztecs, the Egyptians. The Mongolians had a sort of vampire myth. It was about blood-sucking beings, but they weren't immortal.
I mean, every single culture across the entire world has a vampire legend. So there is something to it, but it's probably a simple disease or illness.
I believe there is a basis in fact, a definite fact, because the animal kingdom possesses a lot of them. I don't believe so many cultures would develop a vampire myth without there being some basis in truth, even if that truth is back to a genetic split thousands of years ago that caused a strain or a defect in a certain human gene pool that produced people that needed blood.
I mean, you've had cases in history where people have been accused of being vampires just because they've committed suicide. I mean, in the Middle Ages, you committed suicide, you had a stake through your heart when you were buried to stop you rising from the dead.
Vampires were staked originally. They were staked through the stomach because if they open up a coffin back in like translations.
Sister, don't worry. Say When you get hungry, I'll do what you want me to do. You're a vampire, I'm a vampire too.
I would have actually entered the cemetery, but before I got a chance, as I passed the top gate, something caught my eye and I actually saw a tall figure standing behind the gate, and I reckon it must have been about 7 feet tall. Now the only thing is it could have been floating just above the ground because the bottom of it was just, it seemed to be a part of the blackness. But I did notice 2 points of light which I took to be its eyes, and they were red. Worse than that, this entity, or whatever it was, seemed to be draining me of energy. Now, I'm a trained psychic investigator. It was in my early days then, but even then I realised that I'd come under a psychic attack. And again I experienced, as Thornton described, a sense of losing control of my normal faculties. It was literally like being in a sort of a dream. After I'd witnessed it myself, we had a meeting with the BPOS and we decided to conduct a full-scale investigation into the entity at Highgate Cemetery. And the first thing we decided to do was to check out the cemetery's history, and some interesting things really turned up. We found that a figure had been reported back in the the early 19th century, at the end of the 18th century, and again it was described as a tall, dark figure, but this time it used to